Ms. Graham.
Thank you. We had just turned to your log
Yes.
before lunch, and I wondered if we could go back to that, please, and have it on the screen. And if we could move to the second page, we'll see at the top of page 2 that it says decision number 1.
Yes.
And you said before lunch that this management policy file is designed to record high-level decisions that are taken.
Yes.
Does that involve all high-level decisions?
Well, due to the nature of it, a lot of the decisions may be getting taken by Crown and then passed to us. Where Crown issuing additional instructions, I would usually record it within the policy file, and I think as we move on we'll see that. Some decisions are natural to any investigation. So although you may record them, you don't really need to go into depth because broadly everybody understands what they are. So for example, house-to-house inquiries, you don't actually need to specify what a house-to-house inquiry is because everybody involved in an investigation understands what that. You might need to set the parameters for the house-to-house inquiry, and in this case it was the route Mr Bio took from his home to Hayfield Road. So you would set those sort of things. So it's quite a high level. You don't necessarily need to go into detail because, as I said earlier, that would translate into a series of actions to be issued to staff to complete.
Right. Well, looking at that decision number 1, you give a description of the investigation.
Yes.
If we just move to the bottom of that page for a moment, I think we'll see it says officer making decision. Your signature appears there on the true copy, and the date and the time is given 5th of May 2015.
Yes.
So before we look through the content of this page, can you tell the Chair, obviously this relates to an investigation that started on the 3rd of May.
Yes.
You arrive back at work on the 5th of May and start the policy log.
Yes.
You're giving a description of the incident here on the 5th of May. Did you prepare this on the 5th of May on the basis of your knowledge at the time?
Yes.
Or was it prepared retrospectively?
No, it's prepared at the time. Some entries are prepared retrospectively, and I think I explained that in my Rule 8 statement. So you may be away from the office at meetings or things like that, so you might not be able to complete it that day or even the next day. So you would retrospectively complete it. And if I do retrospectively complete it, I tend to indicate that it's been retrospective, what's actually happened, and then when I create the entry. And again, that's just for the purposes of transparency. If I could also say, my habit in every investigation, murder or other investigation, is always to give a narrative of what my understanding is in decision 1 as to what my understanding of what happened, albeit sometimes that can be quite limited.
So decision 1 may not necessarily be a decision that's been taken, but perhaps a summary of your understanding at that time.
Yes.
And if the Chair looks at the date on any of these pages, and as in here we see it's the 5th of May, was that the date that you prepared this summary?
Yes. It would be late in the day, because obviously I was reading the briefing paper, I was getting briefed by staff, holding lots of discussions and things like that, examining some material that had come in, and you might pick up on it as we go through it, because we were aware, for example, and that's why I referenced DC Derek Connell's statement, which was provided on the 4th, and that indicated that the knife had been found a distance away from where the interaction with Mr Bio took place. Consequently, there was no certainty. I know you've spoken about it during the inquiry, but this narrative that was presented in day 1 that Mr Bio potentially had possession of the knife when he confronted the police officers, and that indicated to me probably or possibly he did not have possession of that knife because it was found a distance away from where the incident, I think it was 30, 40 yards away. So that indicated to me that what we knew up to that stage may not be accurate.
And that was information that was known to you on the 5th of May by the time you prepared this decision number 1.
Yes.
And just to be clear about that, we've heard evidence about a briefing note,
Yes.
which was dated the 3rd of May, and perhaps we could look at that for a moment, which is PIRC 03694. And this will come up on the screen in a moment. But just to give you some of the background, we heard from Mr. Harrower that he'd prepared this briefing note on the 3rd of May based on the information he had at that time.
Yes.
And that was then used, and Mr. Little saw it on the 4th, and then we may hear that, am I to understand, you saw this briefing note on the 5th?
Yes.
And so that's PIRC 03694. I can summarise this really. We heard in relation to the briefing note on page 2 at paragraph 4 that it was reported, this is on the 3rd of May, it was reported that as the officers drove into Hayfield Road, they saw the now deceased coming towards them as the vehicles came to a halt. They could clearly see he was in possession of a knife and was making his way towards them. Some of the officers, unknown how many at this stage, drew their police-issue batons. At least one of the officers also drew their pava spray and issued a warning to the now deceased, who continued to come forward. And the summary of that I put to Mr. Harrower was that this was describing a subject who was the aggressor in that situation, and the police had responded to that aggression using batons and spray.
Yes.
And we had asked previous witnesses why in this decision number 1, which we'll just keep with this decision number 1, if we can look at that page, just maybe further up, we see that you've written here about the events of the early hours. We can move down, please. On being detained, arrested, Sheku Bayo struggled with police officers who physically restrained him. Officers used CS pava spray during the arrest and used police batons against the deceased.
Yes.
And so we can see clearly that there is no reference there to what is contained in the briefing note, that the officers could clearly see he was in possession of the knife and making his way towards them.
Yes.
And that was because you had seen DC Connell's statement by
DC
then.
Connell's first statement is dated the 4th of May. As I said, I don't know what your reference is, but it was statement 22A within the PIRC statements. And his attention had been drawn to the knife lying a distance away from where the incident occurred. He had then photographed the knife and then lifted or seized the knife. So I thought I need to be cautious about assumptions here, because although we're told in the 3rd, and it's in the briefing document you referenced, that he was in possession of the knife coming towards him, well, that didn't really square with the fact that the knife's found 30-40 yards away, and that's why I'm not being definitive about that within my narrative.
Right. And if we can carry on looking at the latter half of the page, there's then a section for a reason, and you've explained that this technically wasn't a reason, it was a narrative, and it says he was taken to the ground by police officers, he was handcuffed to the rear and had leg restraints applied. That was the information that was available to you at the time.
Yes.
He lost consciousness and appeared to suffer cardiac arrest. CPR was administered by police officers and an ambulance summoned. On arrival, Mr. Bai was placed in the ambulance and CPR continued, and he was taken to Kirkcaldy Victoria Hospital where he died. Life was pronounced extinct at 09:04 hours.
Yes.
And once you complete these forms, I think you said you sign these pages.
Yes.
Do you check them for accuracy at that time?
It's as accurate as your knowledge is at that time.
So is it fair to say it's a snapshot of where you are at that stage when you
Yes.
sign?
Obviously, as you progress through any investigation, you're gathering evidence, you're gathering witness statements, so it can be an evolving picture, but it's as accurate as you know at that time.
Thank you. Let's move on to the next page. It remains decision number 1, which you've explained. That's the continuation. And it says, Police Scotland secured the incident scene, appointed SIO Detective Superintendent Pat Campbell. There was an incident scene protocol to recover evidence and undertake forensic scene examination were put in place. You mentioned Gary McEwen, the Divisional Commander, who was appointed the PS Incident Manager. Now, where was that information from, that Gary McEwen was the Police Scotland Incident Manager?
I can't remember where that, excuse me, frog in my throat. I can't remember where that came from, but I think it's more the critical incident manager. He, at the incident had been declared a critical incident. You have a police incident officer who's usually a sergeant or inspector that manages the immediacy of what happened or the incident scene itself. But because this had been declared a critical incident, Mr McEwen had been really, I should say there, critical incident manager, but I've just recorded it as PS incident manager.
We've heard that Gary McEwen was responsible for declaring this a critical incident,
Yes.
so that became his responsibility.
Yes.
All right, thank you. And then it says, Police Scotland notified the Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit of Crown Office, notified them of the death, and Mr David Green instructed that PIRC would investigate the death, with Police Scotland investigating the incidents leading up to the death.
Yes.
And so even at that stage, when you signed this page on the 5th, you were aware that there had been, well, what's been called a parallel investigation or a split in the investigation. And I think you've already described that actually today in evidence. Police were doing the lead up, PIRC were dealing with the events at Hayfield Road and at the hospital.
Yes. And I think also on the 5th, and I can't remember when, the letter from Crown came in, broadening our terms of reference. Now, I can't remember seeing it on the 5th, but I know it was dated the 5th from Crown. Consequently, our terms of reference expanded, and probably from the 6th onwards.
We will come on to that in a moment. But my understanding is that that letter was dated the 5th.
Yes.
So at some point on that date, the terms of reference were expanded to cover both the lead up and the events from Hayfield Road as well.
Yes. Excuse me.
About 09:35 hours, Sunday 3rd of May, Mr Green contacted the on-call PIRC DSI, Keith Harrower, and instructed PIRC to investigate the death as per above. PIRC staff were called out and attended Kirkcaldy, where they met with Police Scotland staff, including their SIO Detective Superintendent Campbell. Joint forensic and incident scene strategies were agreed and overseen by PIRC investigators. Would you describe this as a high-level description of what was happening?
Yes.
I mean, there's no dates or there's no times, given there, or detailed information about handovers or information that's provided.
No, because I think the detail would come slightly later. This was me recording my understanding of events up to that point. Some of the detail may have been lacking. We might not have had that detail, and that's why I tend to be it's quite high level. I'm not going into too many specifics at this point.
Is it fair to say that we've heard evidence that other officers who were involved on the 3rd of May have their own notebooks or perhaps daybooks? We've heard about a policy log from Pat Campbell. So there'd be other documentation available as well as your own log.
Yes.
Thank you. Can we move on to the next page, which again continues decision number 1. PIRC investigators Ferguson and Taylor dealt with the hospital scene and arranged the transport of the deceased to the City Mortuary, Edinburgh. PIRC investigators Sinclair and Rhodes dealt with the incident scene at Hayfield Road and production seized at Kirkcaldy Police Office, including officers' clothing, pava spray, police batons. We've heard evidence from Mr Little about that.
Yes.
And then you mentioned a post-mortem examination was arranged for Monday the 4th of May at the mortuary in Edinburgh. And on to the next section. PIRC Flows Alistair Lewis and John Clarkin were appointed. And then it says about 22:10 hours, 3rd of May, PIRC investigators met with the deceased family and provided an overview of the role of the PIRC. Can I ask you, this is obviously describing events on the 3rd of May.
Yes.
Was it your understanding that it was on the 3rd of May that Alistair Lewis and John Clarkin had been appointed as flows?
I think it was the 4th. Because we didn't have any flows on duty or available to us on the 3rd. As we know, there was a debate about Police Scotland flows, and consequently, when Police Scotland decided not to deploy flows, Keith Harrower and I think it was Alec Maguire went to see the family to explain, we're PIRC, we've been instructed to investigate, and it's our intention to then deploy flows the next day, which would be the 4th. So that's my understanding.
And that understanding, was that from Mr. Little? When you arrived on the 5th of May,
yes.
Did he's given evidence that he contributed information to you so that you could have it for the log?
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Yes.
And did much of the information about the preceding 2 days' events come from Mr. Little?
I would say it came from a combination, primarily Mr. Little, but it came from a combination. So reading documents, documents start to arrive in from Police Scotland. So you read as much as practicable. You also get briefings from some of the staff. But up until that point, obviously, Billy had been in charge. So primarily from Billy, but from some other sources as well.
Thank you. DSI Harrower requested statements from officers involved as witnesses to the incident. Status of the officers is that of witnesses at this stage, exclamation mark.
Yes.
Now tell us about why you've put that with an exclamation mark.
I think what I've said in my Rule 8 statement is I can no longer remember why I placed the exclamation mark.
All right. But your understanding at that time is statements had been requested from the officers as witnesses, and they were witnesses.
Yes.
Not suspects.
No.
Is there any other possibility between suspect or witness?
No, you're either a witness or you're a suspect. Right. To be placed into the category of a suspect, there must be some evidence that indicates criminality on the part of a person. And that's just the way things operate. You can't treat somebody as a suspect without some evidence.
We've heard that if you are going to be treated as a suspect, that status attracts certain protections for you. We've heard you might be interviewed under caution. We've heard from evidence from Conrad Trickett that if you are a suspect, you will be removed from the PIP process entirely.
Yes,
Is that correct?
because you're afforded all the legal protection that any member of the public has, which is the right to silence, right to consult with a solicitor prior to saying anything. So you've got to administer the caution. So it's a completely different status from that of a witness.
Right. But regardless of whether you're a suspect or a witness, you're not compelled to give a statement to a police officer.
No, you're not compelled. Largely most people do give statements, and particularly, I've run murder inquiries involving organised crime, and it's incredibly difficult to actually sometimes get witnesses to speak up. And other times everybody speaks up. Sometimes you just got to work around that. I think as you've explored, and I outline later on within my Rule 8 statement, the unique nature of police officers, where police officers are allowed to use force up to and including lethal force, but they must be accountable for the use of that force. Equally, there is the anomaly within the legislation where in a Crown-directed investigation, PIRC have less powers than in a police-referred investigation, where there is a degree of compulsion that we can apply to police officers in a police referred one, and it comes within Regulation 5 of the 2013 PIRC regulations, where we can require a police officer to provide us with any information within their knowledge, and we can decide the format that should be in. So I want you to provide information in the form of a statement. But we did not have that power, and still do not have that power in a Crown-directed investigation. The legislation is complex.
So I think you explained earlier there's the Crown-led investigation and the Chief Constable referred that can become an investigation.
Yeah.
And although you have certain powers to compel officers to give statements, if it's a Chief Constable referral, that doesn't exist if it's Crown-led.
That's correct. And I think Dame Eilish Angelini, in her report into police conduct matters, has made recommendations which are within the current Police Conduct and Ethics Bill, where there should be a duty of candour placed on police officers to provide an account, no matter what the circumstances.
And is that because of their special status as police officers?
Yes, and I think Dame Eilish had identified, well, it was certainly brought to her attention, and she took cognizance of it, of the anomaly within the legislation where the more serious the investigation, a Crown-directed death, PIRC investigators had less powers than in a police-referred one. It seemed to be upside down. You know, the more serious the investigation, the more powers you should have. Now, I know we also heard from Miss Ball, you put the question to Miss Ball, that you can't actually physically force a pen into any person's hand. But there's never been another occasion before the investigation of Mr. Bile or after the investigation of Mr. Bile's death where police officers have refused to provide statements.
Right. Thank you. And I think it's fair to say in your inquiry statement you've given some information about the proposed duty of candour that may apply. Thank you. Let's move on to the next page, please. And I think this is when we turn to decision number 2. And this is also an entry from the 5th of May.
Yes.
So you were creating this on that date.
Yes, although Billy had instructed the setting up the incident room on the 4th, but I thought it important to record that this was a major inquiry, and that's why I made that entry.
Do you know why Mr. Little hadn't created a management policy file on the 4th? Or even Mr. Harrower on the 3rd?
Probably because they were both active in doing things and were tied up. We know, for example, Billy Little had the post-mortem to go to on the 4th, and then he had to travel through to Kirkcaldy. And of course, Keith was very active on the 3rd, the day of the incident itself. So potentially they just didn't have the opportunity.
So decision number 2, establish a PIRC major inquiry to investigate the death of Mr. Bile with appropriate major investigation rules and strategies.
Yes.
We heard evidence from Mr. Little, who said he'd set up a major investigations team effectively,
Yes.
with numerous staff, and he was appointing roles to individual investigators and allocating tasks.
Yes. And I think that's why I'm just formally recording it within the management policy file.
When it mentions the word strategies, could you give us a summary of the sort of strategies that we may see in the remainder of the file?
Yes, well, I think sometimes there's a merging of the term policy or strategy. So you will have a forensic strategy, and that's to recover forensic evidence. So the seizing of the productions, the examining of them at the forensic lab, etc. You would hold a forensic strategy meeting, you would record the meeting and what was decided at the meeting. So that's a forensic strategy. You would have, there's a range of strategies within all major investigations. So you would have a CCTV strategy, you would have a media strategy, and that's setting out at a high level what the intent is. So the CCTV strategy undoubtedly starts with let's recover every available CCTV, and that gets translated into a series of actions allocated to staff to go out and recover that CCTV. And a high profile event, in this instance the terrible death of Mr. Bio, a lot of media attention, so you need a media strategy. Now, primarily that's handled by your media team, but you will record in here that we will have a media strategy.
And we may also hear there would be a family liaison strategy and things like that.
So again, you would set that in a high level, but primarily family liaison is thereafter managed by the flows themselves, who keep a separate flow log of all that interaction.
And then the reason is given, you wish to undertake a comprehensive and thorough investigation into the death and capture and collect all available evidence for Crown Office.
Yes.
And then the next page covers decision number 3. And this again is prepared on the 5th of May, and it's headed Major Investigation, Roles and Responsibilities, and a list of names and such like is given. And we actually looked at that when we looked at the typed version. And you were mentioned there as giving oversight.
Yes.
Which you've explained. The next page is decision number 4, and this is where we see a reference to the forensic strategy. And you've said implement a forensic strategy to identify, recover and examine all relevant material pertinent to the investigation. And if we move on to the next page for a moment, do we actually see that you've helpfully attached a forensic strategy here?
Yes.
Which is a typed document which you've slipped into the relevant section of your log.
Yes. Usually if there's pertinent documents, rather than repeating them within it, I will just attach. So I'll simply decide, you know, we're having a forensic strategy, then I attach the typed up forensic strategy rather than having to rewrite it.
Right. Thank you. And then if we look at the forensic strategy, do we see it lists the policy, the reason, and then the strategy is listed there as bullet points?
Yes.
And it covers a large number of areas where forensic science will be asked to assist in your investigation.
Yes.
And that includes a post-mortem, but also examination of the knife found at the scene for DNA. It says fingerprints and other evidence. Comparison of the knife with knives from the home of the deceased to identify whether they appear a matching set. And then other things such as photographs, CCTV, physical items, recovery of mobile phones, and other articles, and examination of vehicles as well. And then towards the bottom of that page, do we see examination of officers' clothing, radios, etc., for blood, footmarks, and other relevant evidence.
Yes.
So is this effectively PIRC investigators setting out the scope of the forensic examination that they wish carried out?
Yes.
If we can move on to decision number 5 on the next page. Now this is dated the 7th of May. There's obviously a gap.
Yes.
There's no entry as far as I can see for the 6th. Is there an explanation for that?
Yeah, I think I was busy out the office on the 6th. I think on the 6th I went to see Mr. Anwar and the family. Then from there I then headed up to Kirkcaldy to meet with DCI Keith Hardy and his deputy, who I think was Stuart Wilson. By that time Keith Hardy had taken over from Pat Campbell as the SIO, and I wanted to meet with him, again inform him that I considered the officer's status to be that of witnesses, and I had asked him to individually approach each of the officers, notify them that I consider them to be witnesses, and to request statements from them. I also backed that up with an email and told them that I wanted an individual response from each of the officers. So I was basically tied up on the 6th, so that's why I'm probably writing this retrospectively because I was out of the office doing things.
Right. So, out of the office on the 6th, meeting with the family.
Yes,
And was that the first time that you'd met with the family?
yes. Met in Mr. Anwar's former offices at Carlton Place.
Thank you. And you've also said you went to Kirkcaldy and met with DCI Hardy.
Yes,
Now, you described him as the SIO. We've also heard him described as the single point of contact.
yes.
By that date, the 6th of May, he had, we understand, become a single point of contact. Can you explain what a SPOC, a SPOC is?
Yes. So we in PIRC, as I think as mentioned by others, including Billy Little, we do not have access to police systems. So we don't know what duty that officer is on a particular day, what shift they're on, whether they're on annual leave, whether they're sick, whether they're night shift or anything like that. So we always direct requests for various documentation, because if we try and go and get all that stuff ourselves, it's a lot of stuff is scattered throughout Police Scotland. So storm material radios will be at an area control room, for example. You'll have stuff scattered all over Police Scotland, and therefore the easiest way, and it's always been the case right back since the establishment of PIRC, that we operate through a single point of contact. So we ask Police Scotland to appoint an officer as a single point of contact, and we direct all such requests for whatever to that single point of contact. It's then the single point of contact's job to go and obtain that material, because they will have access to police systems. They will know a lot of the people involved. Consequently, that's the most economic way to go about it, rather than us chasing all over the place trying to find out what the material is. Single point of contact, and that's the way it happens, and that's the way it operates today. For every investigation, they appoint a single point of contact.
And when you say they appoint a single point of contact, who is they?
Police Scotland. Sometimes there can be 3 single points of contact. Now, I know that sounds a bit contradictory, but in some major investigations, so you might have a single point of contact within area control rooms to obtain all that material. You might have one for the general investigation, and you might have one for specialist areas like firearms, or for the more sensitive side of the business that the rest of the police might not have access. So, as I say, you could have 2 or 3 single points of contact. A lot of times Police Scotland will come back to you and say, look, it's not practical for one person to do all this. Can we split it up, and we'll tell you who to contact within the various business areas? And usually we'll agree to that. It's preferable that it all goes through one person, but sometimes it's not feasible. But other times, I think what we've also got to remember is that these officers have, for want of a better expression, their day job to do. So it's quite a heavy responsibility to run around on behalf of PIRC. And Keith Hardy's also managing their aspect of the major investigation at that point. So
for convenience, for questions of economy, ideally one single point of contact.
yes,
And is that to do all communications between PIRC and Police Scotland?
largely yes.
Largely. And so if you wish something from the individual officers, like a statement or some sort of account to be given, would that go through the single point of contact?
Yes, we do not directly, we do not directly approach the police officer. We act through the single point of contact. They transmit the message onwards to the officers.
So that's the practice. What if you
Yes.
decided you wanted to go to the officers direct?
Well, one, as I explained just a short period of time ago, we don't have access to police systems, so we don't know whether they're on duty. We do not doorstep officers at their family homes. for what
Would
I
you
say,
have access to personal details as to where they live?
no, we don't. And that's why we've got to go through the spot, because the spot will tell us when the officer is on duty. And the normal practice is to see them when they're on duty at their place of work. Sometimes we can ask for their shifts to be changed, so that, so for example, if they're night shift, but we want to interview them, they might change their shift to a day shift so that we can interview them during the day. If that's not practicable, there have been some occasions where PIRC staff will come out and do a night shift and go and interview the officer because they're night shift.
I wonder if you can think of any situation where instead of going to the single point of contact, or in addition to that, PIRC have ever made a direct approach to the SPF or to a lawyer representing officers?
No, I can't think so.
Can you think of any reason why that couldn't be done, or why it isn't done?
I think if the officer is a suspect, not a witness, what happens is we notify Professional Standards Department that we consider the officer to be a suspect and that we want to conduct a suspect interview. And that officer can either request that a member of the Scottish Police Federation sit in the interview to support them, or a lawyer is present. And that's normal for a suspect interview. Very rarely, in fact I can't think of any other time, do we approach the officer's solicitor, because they don't need a solicitor, they're a witness. Let's remember, police officers are professional witnesses. They give statements all day, every day. They attend court to give evidence. As part of their duty is to give an account. So there wouldn't be a need to go to their solicitor. Particularly in this case, they've been told in day one, day two, Police Scotland had been told, the single point of contact had been told, a senior officer has been told, we consider them to be witnesses. Day one, day two, day three, day four, all the way up to day 7 when Keith Hardy started to come back to saying, I've now individually approached the officers and told them their status as witnesses.
Right. And perhaps we can just look very briefly at a statement we've looked at from Keith Hardy, which, here it is, it's PS 00667. And this is a self-penned statement from DCI Hardy, completed on the 27th of May 2015, but in relation to events from the week after
Yes.
Mr. Byles' death. And we'll look at it in a moment, but on summary, on the Thursday of the 7th of May, he says in the statement that he received a request from PIRC to make contact with all officers who were known to be involved in the arrest of Mr. Byles and establish whether they were willing to provide an operational statement. And was that actually at your request on the 6th?
Yes, so myself and Mr. Little physically met with him on the 6th. I then backed that up with an email on the 7th, requesting that individually approach the officers. That
was to Mr. DCI Hardy?
Yes.
And then, we'll get this in a second, PS 00667, no. All right, there's a slight glitch there. But just to summarise, on Thursday the 7th of May, that there's a series of paragraphs within this statement that we've looked at with DCI Hardy in evidence, from 1:35 in the afternoon, that he and DI Stuart Wilson spoke to Craig Walker, then Daniel Gibson, then James McDonough, then Kayleigh Good, then Alan Smith, then Ashley Tomlinson, advising them that they were witnesses and asking if they wished to provide a statement. And for those officers, the uniform response was they did not wish to provide a statement at this time on the advice of their solicitor.
Yes.
And then DCI Hardy goes on to explain in this statement at 9:20 on Tuesday the 12th of May that he and DI Wilson spoke with Temporary Police Sergeant Scott Maxwell, and that he also did not wish to provide a statement at this time on the advice of his solicitor. The statement itself does not indicate that he was advised that his status was witness, but we've heard evidence from DCI Hardy that that was the message that was communicated.
Yes.
And then on Wednesday the 13th of May, that Hardy and Wilson spoke to PC Payton, who was also advised he was being treated as a witness, and PC Payton provided he did not wish to provide a statement on the advice of his solicitor.
Yes.
And then on Monday the 18th of May, Hardy and Wilson met with PC Nicole Short. She was advised that she was being treated as a witness, and PC Short provided that she did not wish to provide a statement at this time on the advice of her solicitor.
Yes.
And that was an instruction carried out by Hardy, the single point of contact, in relation to all of those officers on your and Billy Little's instruction.
Yes.
Thank you. Right, we were on the policy log, PIRC 04154. Perhaps we can go back to that and look at decision number 5. And this entry is on the 7th of May. CCTV and digital evidence strategy. So this indicates a decision was taken to implement this type of strategy to identify public and private CCTV which existed, and to capture any material that may have a bearing on the investigation, and also to recover evidence from mobile phones or electronic devices. And am I right in saying at that time that you were aware that an Ashley Wise, who lived in the area of Hayfield Road, had handed over a mobile phone for the purposes of allowing PIRC to look at Snapchat footage that she'd recorded?
That's correct. Some of this can be slightly retrospective, but we've also got to consider, does any other member of the public have recorded something and we are unaware of it? Have we identified all CCTV that might provide views? We also know that one of the witnesses that saw Mr. Bile walking along the road in the lead up to the incident had recorded footage on their mobile phone. So this is a broad strategy to let's capture everything we can. We've already got some stuff, but this is to take cognizance of everything.
And would this include, we've seen footage from a dash cam on a vehicle, would that include that type of digital material that you can gather?
I think that was Harry Kohlberg and his son.
Yes. Thank you. Let's move on to the next page, decision number 6. And this is from the 7th of May also. It talks about a major incident room, establishing a major incident room within PIRC, utilising the Clue 2 operations system, and appropriately staffed to manage all aspects of the investigation.
Yeah.
We've heard from Billy Little that he did that, set that up on the 4th, and he had 3 members of staff manning that with Ian McIntyre, I think, involved.
I think what I'm doing there is formally recording it into the policy log, but again, it's a bit retrospective.
The next page is also completed on the 7th of May, and this relates to family liaison. 2 family liaison officers were appointed to provide information and support to the family of the deceased. Flow strategy and recording of contacts will be documented in the separate flow strategy logs. And the flows were Alistair Lewis and John Clarkin, and they'd been appointed. Now, I think you just said a moment ago you thought they were appointed on the 4th.
Yes.
So this is a retrospective recording of that.
Yes, but I think it's important to record it in the policy log, and to a certain extent you are playing catch up a wee bit in the very early stages of investigations. So sometimes you think, oh, I've not documented that, I'll now place an entry because I know there is there's flows appointed and there's a flow strategy. So in the early stages, some of it is retrospective because you are playing catch up.
Now, in relation to the last couple of items, the CCTV and digital evidence strategy, the family liaison strategy, we don't see copies of these strategies in this section of the log. And we've heard part of the evidence of Mr. Lewis, who is one of the flows. And my understanding of his evidence is that there was not a written flow strategy.
He should record that in the flow log. The policy is high level, it's like appoint flows. Potentially, what the flow does is answer to the SIO, but he should be recording everything within the flow log. Now, the flow strategy has got to be flexible and adapt to the situation of every family. And it's difficult to take cognizance of all the factors. That's why it gets recorded in the flow log, because as you progress onwards, you can establish family dynamics, all these various factors, and that should be recorded in the flow log, not in the management policy file.
So in the earlier example where we looked at the situation where the forensic strategy was copied and inserted into the log, is there a reason why a flow strategy was not copied and inserted into the log?
I can't think of one now, but I'm assuming, and we know what everybody says about assumptions, I expected that Mr. Lewis and John Clerkin would record that within the flow log.
Who did you expect to write the family liaison strategy?
Normally it's the flow themselves. They speak to the SIO and the deputy SIO, but usually the flow creates the strategy to manage the family. As I said, every incident, every death is different, and therefore a lot of the information that you're getting about the family is coming from the family to the flows, and that's why it's important that they're managing that aspect of it. If they become aware of matters that they think should be brought to the lead investigator, the deputy, they would come and tell you. There's got to be a certain extent. Flows are highly trained. PIRC flows do the same training as Police Scotland flows. So you expect them to manage that quite professionally. And Alistair Lewis is a highly experienced flow, as was John Clerkin. So you expect them to manage that.
And in relation to the earlier forensic strategy that we looked at, who had prepared that?
I think I typed that up.
You typed that. And so if you had been typing up the family liaison strategy, would we have seen a copy inside the log?
Probably. If I typed up a document, and you'll see it later on as we come across other things, if I typed something up, rather than having to rewrite it into the policy or management file, my habit was to simply attach that document and say, see attached. So.
And was there any expectation on your part, having entered in the log that there's to be a family liaison strategy? Was there any expectation on your part that Lewis or Clarkin would send a copy to you for insertion into the log?
No, because that would be recorded in the flow logs. Now the flow logs are quite large documents. In fact, in relation to the death of Mr. Bio, I think there was 3 flow logs, which are multiple pages. So the practicality of actually inserting that into this book it's just not practical.
And then if we can look at the reason, so if we move that page up, provide appropriate support to the family of the deceased, acting as a single point of contact for the receipt and provision of information to or from PIRC.
Yes.
And so the idea was that Lewis and Clarkin would be a single point of contact
Yes.
for the family. All information would flow through either of those investigators. And we've also heard that they remain part of the investigation team.
Yes.
They're not simply there to provide support or emotional well-being assistance to the family.
No. It's quite a large burden being a flow. But they're primarily investigators first and foremost. They have a role in supporting the family and transmitting information for the family, but they also have a role in acquiring information from the family and feeding that into the investigation. And that happens in most death investigations, including murder investigations. First and foremost, the flow is an investigator, but they also have a role to play in supporting the family.
Thank you. And then let's look at decision number 8. I think this is also prepared on the 7th of May, and it refers to productions being seized by PIRC, and they have to be entered into a productions register and managed. So again, is this you recording things which are actually already going on?
Yes, I can't remember. So we'd obviously taken possession of certain productions. Some productions remain with Police Scotland, and we're required to seize them effectively from Police Scotland. But you're also, as you move forward, you're seizing additional items. MI stands for Major Instant Production Register. So you're recording what the item is, when it was seized, where it was seized, who it was seized by, and where it is stored. And it's to keep track, because otherwise you can quickly lose track, especially in a major investigation where you're gathering hundreds, if not thousands of items. It's very important to try and keep track of that. And this is this Major Instant Production Register. So it starts at production number 1 and runs onwards, sometimes into the I'm about to punch that again, sorry. From the hundreds, sometimes into the thousands, but you've got to keep track of that.
And do you have an investigator allocated to that role?
Yes.
Then we can move on to decision.
Just if I could interrupt, just before you do that, could I take you back to the previous decision, the one on the family liaison officers? That's it. You just explained a few moments ago that the flow was first and foremost an investigator, but also had a function to support the family.
Yes, my lord.
Now, in your experience, do these two functions ever give rise to a degree of tension?
They can do. I've experienced it. Not only within this one, I've run murder inquiries where the victims were figures involved in organised crime families. They're not particularly trusting of the police, to put it politely. Consequently, there can be a degree of tension between the family liaison officers and the family of the deceased. But they have a job to do, because it's important that we acquire information about the deceased, about sometimes the family dynamics, provide them with information, and particularly where in a murder investigation, if you reach a successful conclusion and arrest people, you will wish to inform the family of that before it hits the media. So, as I say, primarily they are investigators. Sometimes there can be a bit of conflict there. I've experienced it in murder investigations I've ran. Usually, things can be calmed through the flows being sensitive in how they approach the family and try and build bridges or remove barriers. I hope that answers your question, my lord.
Thank you.
We've heard some evidence from, just continuing with this family liaison for a moment, we've heard some evidence about the role of the senior investigator
Yes.
in connection to family liaison officers. And what were your responsibilities in relation to liaising or working with family liaison?
Usually in any investigation where there's a death, my preference as a lead investigator was always to meet the family at the start, just to introduce myself as the person in charge of the investigation. The flow would thereafter take over that sort of liaison function. That was my individual preference. I think it's Billy Little's preference as well. I think he potentially said so. And it's more as a courtesy to introduce yourself. I'm the lead investigator, particularly when it comes to PIRC, because not everybody, there's still quite a lot of members of the public don't understand who PIRC are and our role. So you want to make that introduction more from a familiarity perspective, but then the flows take that forward.
Can we move on, please, to decision number 9? This again is entered into the log on the 7th of May, but it's headed up post-mortem examination. And we've heard evidence that this took place on the 4th of May.
Yes.
And that Billy Little was present at that examination. And it says it's undertaken at Edinburgh City Mortuary at 1300 hours on Monday the 4th of May. We've heard that there was a Kazar examination,
Yes.
roughly between 12 and 12 o'clock.
If I may, ma'am, I think this is more me putting a narrative entry rather than a decision entry.
And you mentioned the pathologists, who's there from PIRC. You mentioned Police Scotland, DC Peter Grady, and also in attendance a number of people there. Peter Gillane, Ricky Casey, Billy Little, Stuart Taylor, Keith Hardy, Bernie Ablett, and SPA Derek Carroll, who was a photographer.
Yes.
I'm conscious we often have a break for the stenographer now. Would that be an appropriate time?
Yes, we'll have a 15-minute break at this point. Ms. Graham.
Thank you. We were looking at decision number 9, and this was a narrative prepared on the 7th of May, and it related to the post-mortem examination. So it's decision number 9. It's page 609861 according to the log. There we are. And you're narrating there that there has been a post-mortem. We've heard evidence that was on the 4th of May.
That's right.
So you're preparing this around 3 days later. Now, was this prepared after a discussion with Mr. Little? Because we've heard he attended the post-mortem.
It would have been, and of course you want to record that the cause of death is unascertained, pending further investigation, because there will be further investigation thereafter it. So Billy Little went to the post-mortem. He would inform me. I would record it in here, so there's a record within the policy file of the post-mortem.
So there's something recording that there's been a post-mortem and what the preliminary cause of death is at that stage.
Yes.
And we've heard evidence from Mr. Little that he prepared a note regarding the post-mortem, who was in attendance, matters of that sort. Did you have sight of that note? I can let you see it. It's PIRC 04148.
To be honest, I can't remember at this stage whether I'd sight of it or not.
Right. Well, we won't go into that in detail. But I want to ask you about the people who were in attendance. You may have seen me ask Mr. Little about this if you've been observing any of his evidence. But there are 3 police officers in attendance at the post-mortem. DC Peter Gillane, DCI Keith Hardy, and a DC Peter Grady.
Yes.
Now, we've heard evidence that the Crown have instructed PIRC to investigate the incident at Hayfield Road and effectively the cause of death of Mr. Bio.
Yes.
PIRC are attending the post-mortem. We've heard that that's arranged under instruction of the Crown,
Yes.
but the cause of death is something that is within the terms of reference of PIRC.
Yes.
We see that 3 police officers are present at the post-mortem.
Yes.
And we asked Mr. Little about that. Now I would like to ask you, although you were noting this on the 7th of May, do you have any views on police officers attending part of what is supposed to be an independent PIRC investigation?
I think what we've got to remember in this case, and it's happened in other cases, is that the police are part of the investigation, and we've got the investigation of the death. But at that stage, at the time of the post-mortem, the police were investigating the incident in Arran Crescent, outside the deceased's home, where he had a violent confrontation with his friend Mr. Said. So potentially he may have picked up injuries at that. Now, I'm presuming that's potentially why the police were at this post-mortem. I've seen it before in other post-mortems where the police, as I described the fatal shooting in the hotel in Glasgow, where the police have got part of the actions because the deceased had injured himself while assaulting people in the lead up to it. So part of those injuries are pertinent to the police investigation. The majority are pertinent to the PIRC investigation. It's not usual, but it does occur.
And you think that could be an explanation why DC Grady, DC Gillane and DCI Hardy were present at the post-mortem?
Potentially, but I don't know what was in their minds or in the minds of Police Scotland.
In a situation where PIRC are leading the investigation into the death, would you, if you'd been attending, expect to ask why the police are there?
I would want to know why they're there, because, well, why are they there? You know, what role do they have? That the death investigation is passed to PIRC. as I've said, it's rare, but it does occur where there's been instances in the lead up to the death that the police have got, and therefore some injuries might have been picked up during those instances that the police will need to be aware of. Now, there's nothing to stop PIRC passing that information back to the police, particularly because once a post-mortem report itself is issued, Crown can give permission for that to be shared with the police, and that has occurred.
So the Crown can give permission for that to be shared with the police.
Yes.
Do you think, are you saying that PIRC can also take a decision to issue that information to the police?
Not without Crown permission.
Without Crown permission. And you've said you would want to know why police officers were present. How would you have gone about finding out why the police officers were present?
Simply ask them.
Now, I think we've heard evidence from Mr. Little that he didn't ask. In terms of the independence of the investigation and the Article 2 considerations we've been talking about, do you have concerns about a post-mortem in the circumstances you were in at that time, or PIRC were in at that time, where police officers are present and PIRC don't know why?
Yes, I would be concerned because I would want to know why they were there. As I previously said, I'm making an assumption, and we know the challenge with assumptions, but I would want to know why they're there. So I'd probably just ask them, why are you here?
And if you weren't satisfied with the answer or the explanation given, what steps would you have taken?
Well, you could tell them I don't think it's appropriate for you to be here. Particularly in high-profile ones, you will have a fiscal there, as was the case here. Bernie Ablett was
Mr.
there.
Ablett.
So you can turn to the fiscal and say, I don't think this is appropriate.
And would you have felt comfortable raising issues like that prior to the post-mortem?
If I see issues, I raise them.
Thank you. Now, Mr. Little gave evidence that he wouldn't normally attend a post-mortem. He had enough to do as lead investigator in a big investigation.
Yes.
So he would normally send someone else
Yes.
to attend. But he gave evidence that he'd been advised by Mr. Ferguson that there was blood in the ears of Mr. Bio.
Yes.
To put that in context, Mr. Ferguson had been tasked with going to Victoria Hospital in Kirkcaldy, and then he was involved in moving the body to the mortuary.
Yes.
And he was also present at the post-mortem. And because of that, as I understand Mr. Little's evidence, he had concerns that the cause of death may have been blunt force trauma to the head.
Yes.
And there was some information available to Mr. Little that batons had been used at the scene.
Yes.
And so he went to the post-mortem for that reason, because he wanted to know the cause of death as soon as possible. And I think in summary, the potential was that the outcome of the post-mortem, if there had been blunt force trauma to the head, could have potentially changed the status of the officers or an officer who'd used a baton.
I'm not sure whether it would have immediately changed the status of the officers, because you would, as I said earlier, police officers are allowed to use force up to and including lethal force. Mm-hmm. You would want additional information to understand what happened, why it happened, and that then may change the status of the officers.
There's no reference in the decision number 9 in the log, no mention at all there of the issue regarding blunt force trauma. And I'm interested in why there's no reference to that. You do mention cause of death at the bottom of that page,
Yes.
being unascertained and further tests are to be undertaken. I'm interested in why there's no mention of this blunt force trauma issue.
I think because by that stage we knew from the findings of the initial findings of the pathologist that blunt force trauma to the head had not caused the death. So that's why I wouldn't reference it.
So, and you knew that how?
through feedback from Billy Little. Obviously, he was at the post-mortem, he spoke to Dr. Shearer. Dr. Shearer would inform him, look, at present, I cannot establish a cause of death, therefore there needs to be additional examination, but certainly blunt force trauma to the head did not cause the death.
I asked Mr. Little about whether he'd spoken to the pathologist about any other potential causes of death to get a preliminary view from her, if that was possible, available. I asked him about the possibility of positional or mechanical asphyxiation contributing to the death. He hadn't spoken to the pathologist about that, he said. Is that something you would have discussed with the pathologist?
I think really we present what is known up to that stage to the pathologist. We then await what the pathologist's findings are. What we don't want to do is colour a judgment of a pathologist, because they're independent. And if you're saying, well, I think positional asphyxia, you know, you're putting an idea into the pathologist's mind. It's no, let them do their job, provide their findings. Now, there are some indicators where you may have positional asphyxia, petechial hemorrhages in the eyes, which could be indicative of positional asphyxia. It's not necessarily the case because there are other reasons for it. So CPR, and we know CPR occurred, can sometimes produce small petechial hemorrhages. So it's very much let the pathologist do their job, communicate to us their findings, but let's not prejudge matters.
Are you suggesting that asking about blunt force trauma to the head would be putting ideas into the pathologist's head?
Well, certainly there was injuries to Mr. Bio's head. We know now, and we knew then, that batons had been recovered at the scene, and the officers had used batons on Mr. Bio. So that was a matter of fact, and you're presenting that fact to the pathologist.
So you don't consider that to have been influential or potentially influential in any way?
No, that's a matter of fact, whereas the other ones are hypothesis. Could it be this? Could it be that? Well, let the pathologist do their job, report their findings. If those findings are inconclusive, which they were here, the pathologist will then undertake, in conjunction with experts, additional inquiries, toxicology, neurological samples, etc.
So if you're trying to avoid influencing the pathologist in any way, you don't mention other potential causes of death.
No.
You do ask about blunt force trauma. The pathologist gives you a preliminary view. Are you thinking about any other possible causes of death at that stage, or just keeping a completely open mind?
You've got to keep an open mind.
Why was there so much interest in blunt force trauma to the head if it wasn't going to be a categoric alteration to the status of the officers? Why not wait until you get the final post-mortem?
What you do is you present the facts as known at that time to the pathologist to inform them. But you don't stray into the realm of hypothesis. You present the facts, because what happened, I think the pathologist needs an understanding of what happened, or potentially what happened, because they can then examine during the post-mortem, well, how did these injuries arise? So there is a potential explanation for how those injuries arrived, which is why you present the facts to them, as understood at the time.
Why the interest, do you think, in blunt force trauma to the head if it wasn't going to alter the status of the officers? Why not simply wait until you get the final report? Was there a reason that you can think of why there was an immediacy or an urgency to finding out about blunt force trauma to the head?
Well, I think as you said, John Ferguson flagged up there was blood in the ears to Billy Little. Billy Little then he knew batons had been used. He knew Mr. Bio had been struck with batons. Had he been struck to the head with a baton? Now, we subsequently find out that that did occur, but I don't think we knew exactly. So we're saying he has been battened. We don't know whether he's been battened to the head because the officers are not telling us until 32 days later, but we knew batons had been used. And that's probably why Billy has specifically wanted that knowledge. So, because having been struck to the head, a strike to the head by a baton can be a fatal blow. And of course we don't have the 9 officers' account of exactly what happened at that scene. We were still left trying to piece things together from witness testimony. Many witnesses had only seen partial matters. Try to figure it out from storm and airwave and all the other things. So I'm presuming Billy just wanted a quick answer as to, is that a potential?
And did that help or would that help the investigation, knowing blunt force trauma to the head had not caused death? Would that allow you to take things forward?
Yes, well, it rules out the fact that the blow from the baton to the head caused death, because we're then left with, okay, so the batons didn't kill him. What was the cause of death? What caused him to die? And very much the initial one was unascertained pending toxicology and neurology, and that takes quite a considerable period of time because the samples get sent off to the universities where they get examined, then they come back and then they get given to the pathologist who writes up the final post-mortem report.
Would it have been helpful to have blunt force trauma to the head being excluded, noted in the policy log? You've noted here other matters to do with the post-mortem.
It might have been, but since we knew that it wasn't a cause of death, I didn't record it. Now, we can argue the pros and cons as to whether I should have put that down, but the fact is I didn't.
I'm wondering if it can be of as much assistance to know what wasn't the cause as what was the cause.
Yes, certainly sometimes.
And in terms of looking at other decisions which have to be made or explored, could knowing what it wasn't help narrow down and focus your the decisions that you're making in the investigation?
It can do. As I say, this was a highly unusual case insofar as it's the only investigation we've had in the last 11 years where the police officers didn't provide accounts of what occurred until 32 days later.
So looking back now, in relation to obviously with hindsight, looking back later to the entry in decision number 9 in your log, do you think it may have assisted to have reference to this issue regarding blunt force trauma to the head added in here?
Potentially, yes. The fact is we did know it. Now, I've not recorded it in here. Maybe I should have, but I didn't.
Can I ask you about another matter? We've heard evidence from Billy Little that he authorised disclosure of that information regarding blunt force trauma to the head was not the cause of death.
Yes.
To be disclosed to the police officers who had attended Hayfield Road. And there's no mention of that in the policy file regarding the post-mortem either.
Yeah. Now, I don't think I became aware until much later that it was Billy's decision, because I knew police officers had been at the post-mortem. I thought it had been them that had transmitted that information. I didn't realise too much later it was actually Billy's decision. So at the time that I created this, I wasn't aware of it. No.
Mr. Little's described this. We took his evidence in some detail on this, and he described it as an unprecedented decision that he had taken.
Yes.
He'd never taken a decision like that before. He's never taken a decision like that since. As a decision and as an unprecedented decision, do you think that is something that should be noted in the management policy file?
Yes, but I wasn't aware of it at the time.
No. When did you become aware that this had been a decision by Mr. Little?
Not for a considerable period afterwards. I was aware of it before the officers gave their statements, which was on the 4th of June.
Yes.
But I can't remember exactly when I became aware of it throughout those 32 days.
Right. And who was it that told you about this decision?
I think it would be Billy himself.
Right. Looking back now, do you think this is a decision that you should have been told about, so to insert it into the policy law?
Probably.
Had you been told about it, would you have entered it into the law?
Yes.
And as part of that log entry, would you have noted down the explanation for why that decision was made in the reason section?
Yes.
The other thing I'd like to ask you about in relation to this page.
Just before you do that, Ms. Graham, you said a moment ago that you thought that it was the police officers who were at the post-mortem that had given that information.
Yes.
Now, given the evidence that you gave earlier this afternoon about the propriety of the police officers being at the post-mortem at all, did that impression that you formed about they having communicated the information give you cause for concern?
Once I became aware of it, but at the point that I became aware of it, it was Mr. Little or Billy who had communicated that to me to say it was him that asked that information. So it was an assumption on my part that it was the police officers, but it was actually Billy, and I found that out, I can't remember when, my lord, but sometime before the 4th of June.
But when you were operating under that assumption, did the existence of that assumption itself not cause you some concern?
I think, as Mr. Little explained, it was, well, his rationale for doing so was to try and unblock the logjam, I think is how he described it, of the officers refusing to provide statements. Chief Superintendent McEwen transmitted the information because he thought it was from a welfare perspective of the officers to let them know, because as I learned, one of the officers was very upset, thinking that the blows to the head could have caused the death of Mr. Bio. So
I'm more interested at this stage in your own state of mind,
yes.
Mr. McSporran, because if you formed the impression, as you say you did, that this information had been given to the attending officers by police officers who were at the post-mortem, whose attendance at the post-mortem you had concerns about, then would that itself not be something that would really exercise you?
I think it would. Now, I can't remember my exact mindset back there, my lord. I think the challenge was it had occurred. I didn't know exactly who had done that. It was an assumption on my part that because the police officers were there, they would transmit that information into Police Scotland, and then Mr McEwen would contact the officers and notify them. I did not immediately know that it was Mr Little that had passed that information to, break the logjam. But I did become aware at some point.
Thank you. Ms Graham.
Looking back now, if you were in that situation today, where you find out that officers have been in attendance at a post-mortem, where there's an expectation PIRC will carry out an independent investigation, but officers are there, you're not sure why they're there, and then later you find out that information has been shared with the 9 attending officers where no statements had been given. Looking back at that situation now, what would you do?
Understand the optics surrounding that, because it looks as though we're providing them with something to try and assuage them, for want of a better expression. And I don't necessarily think that that's proper. Understand Billy's rationale, because we had, in the very early days, a complete lack of understanding as to what occurred. And it's the only time so far that police officers have refused to provide statements. I understand his rationale. He was trying to break the logjam. This is the only occasion when it's occurred, because usually we will not pass that information without Crown's approval.
So looking back now, in a situation such as this, if it happened now, where you think this isn't proper, perhaps you have concerns under Article 2, what steps could you take as a lead investigator to address those concerns?
Well, first of all, if there were police officers in attendance, and there have been cases, I would certainly be saying you cannot pass this information on to any of the principal officers involved. That would be highly inappropriate.
Is that something you do at the time?
Yes.
Or shortly after the post-mortem?
I'd be saying to them shortly after the post-mortem, you cannot pass this, because you need to know the result of the post-mortem. You cannot pass this onwards. Equally, it's a decision for Crown what gets released. It's not for me or any investigator to decide what to pass on to the officers involved. As I say, I understand the rationale why Mr Little did it. It's the only time that it's occurred. If it were to occur again, I don't think we would.
So would you would give an immediate warning or order to the officers that they shouldn't pass any information on, and would you then go to the Crown to seek permission if there was going to be any disclosure of the preliminary post-mortem results?
I think what we would need is a request from Police Scotland, not just those that are in attendance, a request from Police Scotland to say, can we tell the officers the provisional results? We would then go to Crown and say, this request has come in from Police Scotland, what do you want to do? And if Crown say no, then it doesn't get passed.
So you'd wait till you got the authority of the Crown?
Yes.
Thank you. Continuing to look at decision number 9, there's also a reference here to non-engagement by the family at that time who declined to attend the PM. So this is just to recap, you're making this entry on the 7th of May regarding the post-mortem that's been carried out on the 4th.
Yes.
Where did that information come from?
That would have come from Mr Little and others.
So you weren't involved in any way determining whether there'd been engagement or willingness to engage to any extent with the family? No,
because I didn't return to duty until the 5th, by which time the post-mortem had already occurred.
Thank you. Can we move on to page 10, please? Sorry, decision number 10. You're then talking about house-to-house inquiries and the work that's being done in relation to that. The Police Scotland had initiated the house-to-house strategy, but then that had been taken over by PIRC
Yes.
as the terms of reference from the Crown expanded
Yes.
to include all the events.
Yes.
Now, we spoke to Mr. Little about resourcing at this time, and I asked him about when the terms of reference were expanded, to what extent did your resources expand? Do you have a recollection of the resources expanding at this time?
The resources, so the investigative resources did not expand, but we requested assistance from the complaint handling review side of the business, and that was to complete the house-to-house, because if you're conducting house-to-house inquiries, you're recording everybody that lives in the house and whether they've potentially seen anything. If they have seen anything, then you're taking a statement. That's why there's two of you there. So that's why we wanted those resources to complete the house-to-house, because we'd taken it over on the 5th. Police Scotland had two days of doing that. We'd done part of it, which was the incident scene at Hayfield Road. They had not completed their house-to-house inquiries, so we were then taking over. That's why we wanted additional resources from complaint handling reviews to allow us to do that and complete it.
Now, you've entered this entry into the log on the 7th of May. Mr. Little was unable to remember when he obtained those additional resources from the case handling staff. Was it round about the 7th of May that you obtained those additional resources?
Yes, I would think so, because I think, as we said earlier, it was later in the week, so Thursday would be the 7th or Friday would be the 8th, but it was certainly before the weekend.
And then decision number 11 is a narrative where you note on 5th of May there was a Crown Office direction that all aspects of the investigation, including preceding linked incidents, would now be investigated by PIRC. So this is where you record the increase in your
Yes.
instruction. And if we move on to the next page, we can see that letter of instruction has been inserted into the log at this point.
Yes.
And that's, if we look down, we can see that it's 5th of May 2015. There are two areas which require investigation, and this is the circumstances leading up to the incident, prior to contact with the police, and also the incident itself with Mr. Bile. And this was the official authorisation from Crown Office.
Yes.
And turning back, please, to decision number 11, we see that you've also noted that Police Scotland were notified and instructed to cease any investigative actions not already in progress. So once you received that letter from the Crown on the 5th, that was then when Police Scotland were notified at that point that they should cease their investigations.
Yes.
So did Police Scotland's actions continue until the 5th?
Yes.
And then you've noted there that this was a wholly, if we can look at the reason, wholly independent investigations into all the circumstances of the death. And that was the point at which PIRC were in charge of everything.
Yes.
Thank you. And then if we can move on to decision number 12. And again, this is said to be a narrative. It's again dated the 7th of May. And it says, from witness statements, on the evening of Saturday, 2nd May, the deceased and his friends, and then you start to give an explanation of the preceding events.
Yes.
So you've received the letter of instruction from the Crown, you're looking at everything, and is this information that's been given to you by Police Scotland
Yes,
in regard to their part of the investigation?
Yes, because they had taken statements from Mr. Zaid, Mr. MacLeod, and his girlfriend, Mr Dick and his girlfriend, Ms McLeod, I think is now his wife. So they were transferring those witness statements to us, and of course we were reading those witness statements, which gave her because these are the preceding events, so they simply transferred that material to us.
And so they've delivered these statements to you and handed that over. Was there a handover also, or was it simply PIRC investigators reading the statements?
I think from recollection, Police Scotland had been recording matters into the Homes Incident Room, but they would also have the statements themselves, which would also get typed up. So we would go and physically collect them or collect them in electronic format.
How quickly are police statements typed up and available to PIRC?
Usually pretty quickly. Now, it's not that day, but it can be within a day or two, dependent on the circumstances. Sometimes it can take a longer period of time. It can vary dependent on the officer's duties. There's no set time frame for it, but it's better that we get them as soon as possible because it gives us a good picture of what occurred. So
a statement will be taken by a police officer, and then within a day or two that should be available on the system for PIRC investigators.
As the investigation was transferred to us, all of the investigation was transferred to us, we would say hand over everything you have got so far.
So it would be immediately available at that point?
Yes.
And then if a statement's taken by a PIRC investigator, not a police officer,
yes,
how quickly are those statements available to PIRC?
They're available immediately because usually what happens is these are the manuscripts, the written statements. They'll come back to the office, they'll photocopy it. That'll go into the incident room. It can be photocopied a couple of times because myself as SIO or Billy Little might say, we want to read that now. But it would also, here we go again. It would also be passed then to our administrative staff who would type that up. And that is to allow it to be entered into our Clue 2, as it was, operations management system, so as it can be searched and the contents can be searched.
So if an investigator comes back to the PIRC offices, they can photocopy a handwritten statement and hand it straight to you?
Yes.
Was there an expectation that key witnesses or important witnesses would have their statements would be handed direct to you?
Yes, and you'd also want the investigator to come and brief you, saying, look, I've interviewed this person, I consider this a key piece of information. So not all witness statements get drawn to your attention because they might not be of particular pertinence or high profile to the investigation, but you would certainly expect if somebody comes across key information that adds value to the investigation, that they flag that up to you and then show you the statement.
And would that be done on the day or the next day after they've taken the statement, depending on
yes,
timing? And so, obviously, if a statement says, I didn't see anything or I've nothing to say, that wouldn't necessarily be drawn to your attention.
No.
But if there's information from a witness who has seen something, you'd want to know about it straight away.
Yes.
And in addition to that, do we see at the bottom of this page, I don't need to go through the entire narrative with you, there's reference to, if we stop there, several members of the public observed the deceased walking along the road carrying a knife and telephoned police. By the time this is written up, 7th of May, had you been able to gather in the storm records? We've seen storm records in the inquiry with information about phone calls made by the public. Was that available to you?
I think so, because that's where we would get the detail. Equally, those were witnesses that needed to be seen, either initially by the police or by PIRC. And those are also the key witnesses, because they describe the events in the lead up to the incident.
So by the 7th of May, PIRC are in charge of the entire investigation.
Yes.
The police have delivered statements that they had taken. You have your own investigators carrying out work.
Yes,
And by this stage, are you effectively the lead investigator?
yes,
And you're also providing information in the management policy log.
yes. There's a lot of reading to be done during initial stages. It's almost information overload, but you just get knuckle down, get on with it, read it as much as possible. But I said earlier, if there's a key bit of information, you expect the investigator to flag that up to you.
Can we look at just some of the information that you may have had available?
Yes.
I'd like, first of all, to look at, we've heard evidence that there were 2 eyewitnesses to the events in Hayfield Road.
Yes.
And these were key witnesses, Ashley Wise and Kevin Nelson.
Yes. I think there were other people who saw bits of what happened. Because I know there was, I can't remember the witness's name, but he saw the struggle on the ground with the police officers.
We've heard a lot of evidence from passers-by,
Yeah.
people who made telephone calls in relation to all of the incidents.
Yes. So it wasn't just Kevin Nelson and Ashley Wise. There were other people who witnessed some of the actions. So they were also key witnesses.
We've heard from people who were perhaps driving by or in the vicinity who maybe saw things. Is that the type of people you're thinking
Yes.
about?
Because I know there was one witness, can't remember the witness's name, but saw the struggle on the ground.
Right. In relation to events in Hayfield Road, we've heard that Ashley Wise and Kevin Nelson, at that time at least, lived in the vicinity and saw parts of the events as they panned out.
Yes.
And they're
Kevin Nelson was a ground floor flat. Ashley Wise was a first floor flat.
So can I ask you about, Ashley Wise gave a statement to officers on the 3rd of May,
Yes.
but we're aware that an investigator from PIRC went to speak to Ashley Wise on the 5th of May at 19:20 hours.
Yes.
Can I ask you to look at this statement and see if when you saw that?
Yes.
So it's PIRC 00043, and you'll see that this is a statement. We'll see it's taken on the 5th of May at 19:20 by investigator Alex Maguire from Ashley Wise. And this contained information. If we look at page 2, please. If we can look at paragraph 5, which is about halfway down. Here we are. I saw a black man in the street. Do you see that paragraph there?
Yes.
I saw a black man in the street. He was nearly down on the ground. He was surrounded by police officers. There were at least 6 police officers surrounding him. I saw the police officers all over him. What I mean is that they were holding him on the ground. And then if we skim down to the final 3 paragraphs on that page, you can see when the man was on the ground, I heard him screaming. It was a horrible sound. I think the black man was on his back when lying on the ground. I'm not sure if he moved whilst on the ground. I saw him lying on the ground. I could see that his wrists were restrained. His hands, arms were in front of him. The police officers were still lying on top of him. Then there seemed to be a pause, a break. The man had been quiet for a little while. In this period, the police officers appeared to be speaking with him. I could not hear any of his responses. If we move on to the next page. But it appeared the police officers were having a conversation with him. I think the police officers were lying on top of him a long time. I think it was at least 5 minutes they were lying on top of him. It may have been about 10 minutes. This includes the time when he was being taped to his legs. At all times he was surrounded by police officers. There were at least 6 police officers around him at all times. So that's just a glimpse of the type of information that was contained within Ashley Wise's statement
Yes.
to investigator Maguire. I'm interested, now this was taken at 1920.
That would be when it started.
That's when it
so-
started. So when would you have heard about the information contained within this statement?
Probably the next day, because she was a key witness. And as we know, she'd also recorded part of the interaction on her mobile phone. So if they've started that at 1920, I don't know how long it took them to take that statement, but then they've got to travel all the way back from Kirkcaldy, so they're maybe getting back to the office 10, 11 at night, and therefore it would be the next day that you would become aware of it, because we knew she was a key witness.
And you would expect Mr. Maguire to speak to you about it?
Yes.
Provide you with a copy of that statement?
Yes.
So that would be the following day, which would be the 6th of May.
Yes, I would think so.
Right. And sorry, I missed out a section that I should perhaps have read to you. Let's look at page 2. It's paragraph 6. And it's the final sentence. The paragraph begins, what it looked like to me was, do you see that paragraph?
Yes.
And the last sentence of it is, it looked like one officer was using a baton to hold the man down. It was on his upper chest towards his throat. So that's another element of the information
Yes.
that was provided to PIRC. Did you read this statement on the 6th?
I presume I did.
Did you have a conversation with Mr. Maguire about it?
I can't remember, but since this is key information, I would expect it would have been flagged up to me and Mr. Little.
And let's look at another statement that I understand was taken on the 5th of May, PIRC 00019. And you'll see that this was a statement taken from Kevin Nelson
Yes.
on the 5th of May at 2015, and this one was taken at 1900 hours, so again taken in the early evening.
Yes.
And it was taken by investigator Karine Pattenden. You see that?
Yes.
And it was also in the presence of DSI Brian Dodd. So I understand that's investigator Dodd.
Yes.
So 2 PIRC investigators have taken this statement. And again, would you have had the opportunity to, well, let's look at this statement first. If we can look at page 2 first of all. And I'm looking towards the bottom of that page, 3rd paragraph from the bottom. And it begins, when this male, do you see that on the screen?
Yes.
When this male started walking along the road, he appeared to be acting as if the police were not talking to him. He ignored everything that was being said. My view was clear. I would say the male was about 30 yards from me, and at this time he did not appear to be carrying anything in either of his hands.
Yes.
And I think you said earlier that it was your understanding, by the time you wrote your initial narrative, that a statement had been obtained which cast doubt on the suggestion that appeared in the briefing note that Mr. Bio had a knife in his hand and was
Yes.
approaching the
And
officers.
I think that was the statement of DC Connell, which was provided on the 4th, because he recovered the knife, and we knew that the knife had been recovered. And I know we've seen photographs and video of the instant scene, but it was recovered near the roundabout, whereas the incident had occurred further along near where the bus stop was. So there was a distance between them.
So you're adding this information from Kevin Nelson to the information you already have about the location of the knife when it was found
Yes.
from DC Connell.
And it's helping to build the picture, because the knife's found here, the incident happens here, here's somebody telling us, I didn't see him with anything in his hands. And of course that changes the narrative, because the initial narrative was that he'd been carrying a knife when the confrontation occurred.
And then there's comment that I could hear the male police officer shouting at him. The only words I could make out were "get down." And then if we move on to page 3, again, I'm really just taking a snapshot of some of the entries in the statement. Paragraph 5, please, the black male. There we are. The black male then stepped forwards towards the female officer and appeared to lunge at her with his left fist towards her face, head area. I believe he struck at her with his closed fists at least 3 times. I heard her scream out, so I cannot be positive, but I believe that at least one of these fists struck her. And then he says, at this point I decided to go into the front garden to have a closer look. I do not know why I did this other than being curious. I believe it may have taken me between 10 and 20 seconds to do this. I exited my house via the front door and stood looking over my gate. And then in this time, the black male now appeared to be face down on the pavement to the left of my house on my side of the street. I could no longer get a clear view of this male. There appeared to be 5 or 6 male police officers attempting to restrain him. All of these officers were dressed in uniform. I observed one officer appeared to be kneeling on the ground with the weight of his upper body by use of his arms to the black male's shoulder or back of neck area. Do you see that?
Yes.
I would not be able to describe this police officer. The other police officers appeared to be laying across the black man's body. So again, in terms of this statement and the information that's contained in that, when would this have first been brought to your attention?
I believe early doors, because I do remember being told, look, and probably the next day, because if this starts at 1900, by the time they complete it and travel back through. So here's 2 key witnesses, Ashley Wise and Kevin Nelson. This would have been flagged up to us as quickly as possible, which is probably the next day, because we're trying to build a picture of what occurred in the absence of the accounts of the officers, and therefore it's almost like a jigsaw where you're taking as much relevant information as you can and trying to complete the picture. I'll get over that.
No,
So,
it's fine. So we've got nothing from the officers, no basic facts, initial accounts or statements of any description. You've got no use of force forms completed, no use of spray forms completed.
Yes.
And by the 6th of May, you've got 2 statements from eyewitnesses
Yes.
containing the information we've looked at, and you've got DC Connell's statement indicating that a knife was found at a distance away.
Yes.
And I want to move on and ask you some questions about that scenario, but it's 4:15. I wonder if that would be an appropriate time.
We'll continue with your evidence tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, Mr. McSporran.
Thank you, my lord.
Inquiry will adjourn.